She was called the woman who broke up the Beatles, but the truth about Yoko Ono's influence on John Lennon is far more disturbing than anyone ever imagined. What happened behind closed doors wasn't just about love or art or even control. It was about psychological manipulation so sophisticated that even John's closest friends didn't recognize it until it was too late. In May 1968, Yoko Ono walked into Abbey Road Studios and changed the course of music history forever. But she didn't do it with talent, or charm, or even seduction. She did it with a technique so subtle, so carefully calculated, that John Lennon never realized he was being systematically isolated from everything and everyone he had ever loved. The other Beatles saw it happening. They tried to warn him, but by then John was no longer the man they had known since childhood. Tonight, we're revealing the untold story of how a conceptual artist from Tokyo dismantled the most successful band in history, not through accident or passion, but through a deliberate campaign of psychological warfare that took 7 years to complete. This isn't the love story the media sold you. This is the real story of influence, manipulation, and the complete transformation of John Lennon from rock god to willing prisoner. To understand what Yoko Ono did to John Lennon, you need to understand who she was before she ever heard the name Beatles. Born into one of Japan's wealthiest banking families, Yoko spent her childhood learning that money could buy anything: influence, access, power, even people. Her father was a banker who moved money for politicians and industrialists. Her mother was a socialite who collected artists the way other women collected jewelry. From the age of 5, Yoko understood that relationships were transactions and that the most valuable currency in the world wasn't money, it was emotional dependency. By 1966, Yoko had been living in New York for 6 years, building a reputation in the avant-garde art scene as someone who understood how to manipulate wealthy patrons into funding her increasingly bizarre projects. She convinced people to pay thousands of dollars to hammer nails into boards. She sold bottled air as conceptual art. She staged performances where audiences paid to watch her sit motionless for hours. Critics called her work brilliant, but those who knew her personally understood what she was really selling: the illusion that supporting her made you special, enlightened, part of something important. John Lennon was the ultimate target she had been preparing for her entire life. When John first encountered Yoko's work at the Indica Gallery in November 1966, he was at the most vulnerable point of his adult life. The Beatles had stopped touring. His marriage to Cynthia was falling apart. He was experimenting with LSD and Eastern philosophy, desperately searching for meaning beyond the screaming crowds and endless hotel rooms. He was a man who had achieved everything the world could offer, only to discover that none of it made him feel less alone. Yoko's installation that night was called Ceiling Painting. Visitors climbed a white ladder to read a single word written in tiny letters on the ceiling. Yes, most people thought it was pretentious nonsense, but John saw something different. He saw hope. He saw possibility. He saw a woman who understood that sometimes the simplest word could change everything. What John didn't realize was that every element of that installation had been designed specifically to attract someone exactly like him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the real story behind music history's biggest mysteries, hit that subscribe button now. We're just getting started. And trust me, what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about the Beatles. Yoko's pursuit of John Lennon began immediately, but it wasn't romantic, it was strategic. Within days of their meeting, she was sending him copies of her book Grapefruit, filled with conceptual art instructions like draw a map to get lost and light a match and watch till it goes out. To most people, these seemed like meaningless artistic pretensions, but to John, desperately trying to break free from the commercial constraints of being a Beatle, they seemed like messages from someone who understood his artistic soul. The truth was more calculated. Yoko had studied John for months before their meeting. She knew about his mother's abandonment, his father's absence, his desperate need for approval disguised as rebellious independence. She had read his interviews, analyzed his lyrics, identified his psychological weak points with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Her early letters to John were masterpieces of emotional manipulation. She never asked for anything directly. Instead, she created scenarios where John felt compelled to rescue her from various artistic and financial crises. "I am so alone in my work. She wrote in February 1967, "Sometimes I think about giving up everything and returning to Japan, but then I remember that somewhere someone understands what I am trying to create." John, who had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, was intoxicated by someone who seemed to need nothing but understanding. He began visiting her studio, funding her projects, defending her work to his increasingly concerned friends. When Paul McCartney suggested that Yoko might be taking advantage of John's generosity, John became furious. "She's the first person who's ever believed in me as an artist, not just as a Beatle," he told Paul. "If you can't see that, maybe you don't know me as well as you think you do." The isolation had begun. By early 1968, Yoko had established herself as John's artistic collaborator, spiritual advisor, and emotional confessor. She convinced him that the Beatles were holding him back creatively, that their commercial success was corrupting his pure artistic vision. She introduced him to heroin, not as a recreational drug, but as a tool for expanding consciousness and breaking free from conventional thinking. Most importantly, she made herself indispensable by becoming the only person who could make John feel truly understood. The moment Yoko achieved total control came in May 1968, when John called her at 3 in the morning. Cynthia was in Greece on vacation with their son Julian. John was alone in his mansion, high on LSD, convinced that he was dying from spiritual emptiness. When Yoko arrived at Kenwood that night, she found John curled up on his kitchen floor, sobbing like a child. Instead of comforting him, she sat down beside him and said, "This is what happens when you try to be someone you're not. The pain will stop when you stop pretending." They made love that night, but more importantly, they made a pact. John would divorce Cynthia. He would bring Yoko into the Beatles' inner circle. He would publicly support her art, no matter how strange it seemed to outsiders. And in return, she would never leave him alone with his thoughts again. The transformation of John Lennon began immediately. Friends who had known him for decades described the change as horrifying. George Harrison later said it was like watching someone disappear inside their own body. John was still there physically, George remembered, but his personality, his humor, his independence, it was all gone. He became like Yoko's ventriloquist dummy. The first public sign came during the Beatles' White Album sessions in the summer of 1968. Yoko attended every recording session, sitting inches from John, whispering constantly in his ear. When other band members suggested she wait outside during certain songs, John became hostile and defensive. "She's my artistic partner now," he announced during one particularly tense session. "If she can't be here, then neither can I." Paul McCartney tried to maintain diplomacy, but privately, he was alarmed by what he was seeing. John started dressing differently, talking differently, even walking differently. Paul told friends years later, "He stopped making eye contact with any of us. When Yoko spoke, he would nod along like he was hearing the voice of God. It was honestly frightening to watch." The real genius of Yoko's influence was how she made John believe that every suggestion came from his own artistic awakening. When she convinced him to record experimental tape loops and avant-garde soundscapes, she presented it as John finally discovering his true creative voice. When she encouraged him to distance himself from Paul's commercial pop sensibilities, she framed it as John evolving beyond his immature musical partnership. When she suggested that the Beatles were holding him back from achieving his full potential as an artist and activist, she made it sound like a revelation John had arrived at independently. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're learning something new about this incredible story. And let me know in the comments, did you ever suspect there was more to Yoko's influence than the official story? Your thoughts help shape these videos. The most disturbing example of Yoko's psychological manipulation came during the recording of Revolution 9, the infamous experimental track on the White Album. The song consists of tape loops, sound effects, and random audio clips layered into an 8-minute collage that most Beatles fans consider unlistenable. But to John, it represented the future of music, the artistic breakthrough he had been searching for his entire career. What John didn't know was that Revolution 9 was entirely Yoko's creation. She had assembled the tape loops in her studio weeks before presenting them to John as inspiration for your next artistic evolution. When John played the rough mix for the other Beatles, claiming it as his own composition, Yoko sat silently in the corner, watching as John defended ideas that weren't even his own. "That was the moment I realized we had lost him completely," Ringo Starr said decades later. "John was fighting us over a piece of music that he hadn't even created, as if his life depended on proving that this incomprehensible noise was genius." Yoko had somehow convinced him that his artistic credibility was tied to defending her ideas as his own. The psychological manipulation reached its peak during the filming of Let It Be in January 1969. For 30 days, cameras captured every moment of the Beatles' disintegration, and Yoko was at the center of it all. She sat beside John during every rehearsal, sometimes literally attached to him through headphones so they could listen to the same audio feed. When John went to the bathroom, she followed. When he took a cigarette break, she was there. She created a cocoon of dependency so complete that John began to panic if she was out of his sight for more than a few minutes. The most heartbreaking aspect of Yoko's influence on John wasn't what she encouraged him to do, it was what she convinced him to abandon. John had always been the rebel Beatle, but his rebellion had been joyful, playful, rooted in a love of life and music that was infectious to everyone around him. Under Yoko's influence, his rebellion became dark, angry, directed not at injustice or authority, but at anyone who reminded him of who he used to be. His relationship with his son Julian became one of the first casualties. Julian was 6 years old when Yoko entered their lives, old enough to understand that his father was changing in ways that didn't include him. John, who had once spent hours teaching Julian to play guitar and write songs, suddenly became distant and critical. When Julian drew pictures or wrote stories, John would show them to Yoko for approval before offering any praise himself. Cynthia Lennon later described watching John transform from a devoted father into someone she barely recognized. He stopped asking about Julian's school, or his friends, or his dreams, she remembered. Everything had to be filtered through Yoko first. If she wasn't interested in something, John wasn't allowed to be interested either. It was like watching someone slowly erase himself. The isolation extended to John's oldest and closest friendships. Pete Shotton, who had known John since childhood, found himself gradually excluded from John's inner circle. Stuart Sutcliffe's sister Pauline, who had been like family to John, stopped receiving his calls. Even Aunt Mimi, who had raised John after his mother's death, was subjected to Yoko's disapproval whenever she tried to maintain her traditional relationship with her nephew. Yoko convinced John that his past was holding him back, Mimi said years later. Anyone who remembered who he used to be was suddenly a threat to who she was helping him become. She made him believe that love was about transformation, not acceptance. The most insidious aspect of Yoko's influence was how she made John believe that this isolation was his own choice, a necessary step in his artistic and spiritual evolution. When friends expressed concern about his dramatic personality changes, Yoko convinced John that their worry was actually jealousy, evidence that they couldn't accept his growth beyond their limited understanding. By 1970, John Lennon had been completely rebuilt in Yoko Ono's image. He dressed in white to match her aesthetic preferences. He spoke in the conceptual art language she had taught him. He adopted her political causes, her dietary restrictions, her sleeping schedule, even her way of walking. Friends who encountered him during this period described the eerie sensation of talking to John's body while hearing Yoko's words coming out of his mouth. The psychological transformation was so complete that John began to lose the ability to remember who he had been before meeting Yoko. In interviews from 1970 and 1971, he frequently contradicted well-documented facts about his own life, replacing real memories with versions that aligned with the narrative Yoko had constructed about his artistic awakening. He claimed that the Beatles had never been creatively satisfying, that he had always felt like an outsider in his own band, that meeting Yoko had saved him from a life of commercial compromise. The ultimate test of Yoko's influence came with the recording of Double Fantasy in 1980, John's first album in 5 years. For the previous half-decade, he had been living as a house husband in New York, raising his son Sean while Yoko managed their business affairs. To the outside world, it looked like John had found peace and happiness away from the pressures of fame. But the truth, revealed through studio recordings and producer interviews, was far more complex. Before we continue with this shocking revelation, take a moment to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Stories like this take weeks of research, and your support helps us bring you the truth behind music's greatest mysteries. During the Double Fantasy sessions, producer Jack Douglas noticed something disturbing about John's creative process. John would come in with ideas, Douglas remembered, but before he could even finish explaining them, he would look to Yoko for approval. If she shook her head or looked disinterested, he would immediately abandon whatever he was working on and ask what she thought he should do instead. The album was supposedly a celebration of John and Yoko's relationship, with alternating tracks showcasing each of their artistic voices. But engineers who worked on the sessions later revealed that many of John's personal songs were actually written by committee, with Yoko providing the emotional content and John translating her concepts into musical form. She would tell him what feelings to express. Session musician Hugh McCracken said years later, John would sit at the piano, playing chord progressions, while Yoko described the emotions she wanted the song to convey. It was like watching someone paint a portrait of someone else's dream. The most chilling example was Starting Over, ostensibly John's joyful return to music making. But audio from the original sessions, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests decades later, reveals that the song's optimistic lyrics were actually written to convince John himself that he was happy. Between takes, Yoko can be heard coaching John on how to express emotions he wasn't actually feeling. "Sing it like you mean it," she says during one break. "Remember, you're not performing for other people, you're convincing yourself that this is what you want." John's response is barely audible. "Sometimes I forget what I want." Yoko's reply is swift and sharp. "That's because you're still thinking like a Beatle. Stop remembering and start becoming." The tragedy of John's final years wasn't that he was unhappy, it was that he had forgotten how to recognize his own happiness independent of Yoko's approval. Friends who visited the Dakota apartment described a man who seemed to be constantly performing a role, even in private. John would start to tell a story about his childhood or his early days with the Beatles, then suddenly stop mid-sentence, glance at Yoko, and change the subject to something safer, more aligned with the narrative she preferred. Leave a comment below and let me know, do you think John was aware of what was happening to him, or had the manipulation become so complete that he genuinely believed he was living his own life? This is one of the most tragic aspects of the whole story. Mark Chapman, John's eventual murderer, later said in prison interviews that what motivated him wasn't hatred for John Lennon, but pity for what John had become. He wasn't even himself anymore, Chapman said. "I wasn't killing John Lennon, I was putting him out of his misery." While Chapman's actions were inexcusable and his reasoning deeply disturbed, his observation about John's psychological state aligned with what many of John's old friends had been thinking for years. The most haunting aspect of Yoko's influence on John Lennon is how completely it succeeded, even beyond his death. In the 40-plus years since John was murdered, Yoko has carefully managed his legacy, controlling which stories get told, which recordings get released, which aspects of his personality are remembered by new generations of fans. She has positioned herself not just as John's widow, but as the guardian of his true artistic vision, the only person qualified to interpret what he would have wanted. When Paul McCartney attempts to share memories of the John he knew before 1968, Yoko's representatives quickly issue statements correcting the record, insisting that Paul's version of John was incomplete, that the real John only emerged after meeting Yoko. Widest proof of her psychological dominance is how John's own words have been used to validate her version of their relationship. Every interview John gave after 1968, every song lyric expressing devotion to Yoko, every public statement about his artistic rebirth, all of it serves as evidence that her influence was positive, transformative, exactly what John needed and wanted. But here's what most people don't realize. By the time John was giving those interviews and writing those songs, he was no longer psychologically capable of expressing any other opinion. The manipulation was so complete, so sophisticated, that even John himself believed the official story. The real John Lennon, the working-class hero from Liverpool, who changed the world with 3 chords and attitude, had been systematically erased and replaced with someone else's idea of who he should be. The tragedy isn't just that we lost John Lennon in December 1980, it's that we had already lost him 12 years earlier, and most of the world never noticed. The man who died outside the Dakota wasn't the same person who wrote Strawberry Fields Forever or A Day in the Life. That person had been gone for years, replaced by a carefully constructed psychological puppet who looked like John, sounded like John, but was actually someone else entirely. Today, Yoko Ono, is in her 90s, still controlling John's legacy from the same Dakota apartment where she systematically dismantled his personality half a century ago. She remains one of the wealthiest women in entertainment, largely due to her complete control over the Beatles' catalogue and John's solo work. She has been praised as a feminist icon, an avant-garde artist, and a peace activist. But for those who knew John before 1968, she will always be something else, the woman who took the most authentic artist of his generation and turned him into a living monument to her own psychological brilliance. The influence of Yoko Ono on John Lennon wasn't love, though it masqueraded as love. It wasn't artistic collaboration, though it was marketed as artistic collaboration. It was the systematic psychological reconstruction of a human being, accomplished so skillfully that even the victim was grateful for his own destruction. The real tragedy is that John Lennon, who spent his career singing about truth and authenticity, died without ever knowing who he really was. In our next episode, we'll examine the final 24 hours of John Lennon's life and reveal evidence that suggests his murder wasn't the random act of a deranged fan that we've all been told to believe. Because sometimes the official story is just another form of control, and the truth is more dangerous than anyone wants to admit. If this story opened your eyes to the reality behind one of music's most famous relationships, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share this video with anyone who still believes that love and manipulation are always easy to tell apart. And let me know in the comments, what other music industry relationships do you think deserve this kind of deep investigation? Because the truth about our heroes is often more complex than the myths we build around them, but it's always more important.